Today I'm going to talk about, never hiring a bad originator again. I know it seems like a dream, but really the reality of it is that in this market that we're going forward in, we have to be certainly more accurate with who we are hiring. And I'll talk about that in the next few minutes. Just a little bit about myself. For those of you that I do not know, I would just mention that I've been in the business for a long time, certainly ran operations at one point, was a collector back in the day, was also at Fannie on the capital market side, and actually obviously have also run sales. Back in the mid-90s, I started my sales consulting business, and what I'm going to share today with you is the research that we have found in looking at not only the best practices of the top originators, but what really makes these people tick. We have psychologists that are located in Texas, and we handle many of the large lenders in mortgage banking. All of us have had the grim reality of looking at the hiring component and trying to figure out who should I hire versus who's actually going to be effective as an originator. So today we're going to talk about why is hiring so difficult. We'll talk about the drive part and what are the personality traits that really make up people that are successful in mortgage origination. We'll talk about the structured interview process, what works when you are interviewing mortgage originators, and how pre-hires really help you to save time and money by basically screening out those that really do not have the talent. So let's get started. We've all been there. In fact, actually, this is the reason why I had started my business back in the 90s, was because as a former, head of sales, we all have people like Bob here, which you feel that his resume looked so wonderful on paper, he interviewed well, but when it really came to the issue of actually producing, he really was a bust. And so when we go forward in the purchase money market, which we are currently in now, this is a market where we really do need to require people with selling skills and selling talent. In the refi market, which obviously has been on for a long time, order takers could be successful, but they obviously are not going to work in this current market. So if you look at what we have found over the last 15 years of analyzing top originators and their personality traits, it really does come down to, two parts. And the part we're going to spend a lot of time on today is the drive side of it. But obviously it's a combination of people skills and also a combination of drive component. The people skills, I think from an interviewing standpoint, are fairly easy to identify with during the interview sequence. The drive part, not so easy, and typically is what is the issue for many hiring managers, because whether the person has drive can really be masked in other ways that turn out to be not really indicative of whether the person can sell. So there are 9 personality traits that are a composition of the personality side and also the drive side of it, and we'll talk about them more specifically in a few seconds. Drive itself, just to make sure we're all on the same wavelength, and I think as a hiring manager, is that it really does come down in layman terms of, is that person a self-starter? Are they self-motivated? Do they have the self-discipline? And are they self-sufficient? Because frankly, in mortgage origination, it's not for the faint of heart. We need individuals that obviously are, again, in the components of being a self-starter is what you are looking for as a manager. And we're going to talk about what those translate into from a psychology standpoint. Why is drive so important? I certainly think that most of us today recognize that the refi market is certainly fading. As far as 2014 is looked at, drive is looked at as being more than ever required because the market itself is much more difficult. And obviously it's the core out of your prospecting capability. The individual has to have the drive side of it. And the reality of it is that drive really cannot be taught. It's not a training issue. When you have originators that are currently with you and they're not prospecting, you can give them basically a title of a call reluctance person, or frankly what you really have is somebody not matched for the position. So we would tell you, and the research would tell you, is that there's really no training that's going to correct somebody that does not have drive. And the reality of the drive situation is that it's early on formed in individuals. That does not mean that it's genetic. What it does mean is that the persons that develop essentially this self-starter, self-motivated, these are things that occur basically early on in life, and it's our job as a hiring manager is to identify which individuals have that, which really kind of leads to your interviewing needs to be focused on is really seeing the person as they really are. So again, it's a situation of that the interview needs to be structured in such a way where not only does the person have relationship skills, but the drive component has to be part of what they're bringing to the plate. We do know from research, and we have looked at this issue for many years now, that drive is not something that is related to whether a person has a college degree or not. It's also not related to who they worked for. So much in mortgage banking, what we end up doing is overvaluing who was the previous employer. You could be with a named company, but because of the refi market, you certainly have experienced individuals that really just are not matched up for being business development people. So who you worked for, whether you have a college degree, are not predictive traits as far as being a successful mortgage origination person. We've also looked at, it doesn't matter how much the person knows about consultative selling. Again, some of the thinking is that the more the person knows what they should do, that they actually will do it. We have found over, again, these 15, 16 years that the amount of sales knowledge that a salesperson has doesn't really translate into whether they will be successful as an originator. So when we look at it from a technical standpoint, drive is all about having 5 personality traits. Again, 5 is part of the total of 9. The other 4 are really people or relationship skills. And what our research has shown is that successful mortgage originators are individuals that have high energy. Again, high energy isn't having average energy, it's having essentially a high level of energy. So when you're looking at a mortgage originator or someone that is applying to be one, you really are looking at, does that individual have high energy? And I'll show you more of what that looks like from a pre-hire assessment. The second component of drive is optimism. What we are saying is that top mortgage originators are individuals that are very optimistic. And so when you look at that in the interview component, you really want to be sensitive to the issue. Is the person a half-full person or someone that is a half-empty person? And obviously the key component of drive is self-reliance. This is a trait which is a significant trait in mortgage origination, and it's a trait that can be identified through essentially a pre-hire or in your interview type questions. The fourth part of drive is focus, or what we call follow-through. What you see with top of mortgage originators are these are individuals that are very task-orientated. So the completion of step 1 to step 2, those are individuals that like to go basically through a series of steps. That translates into focus. There's been a lot of work that's been done recently in general psychology about talking about the importance of focus, and that's certainly one of the traits that we see in having the drive to be a successful mortgage originator. And finally, it's really not that much different with other consultative selling, but the individual has to have a high level of resilience. As we all know, in sales, again, you don't bat 100%. You have to have the ability to come back. So we define drive as being these 5 personality traits, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. But basically, that's what you were looking for, and that's what we see is predictive of being successful in mortgage origination. So then you have to ask the question, why do we keep hiring all these people that don't have drive? When you really get down to it, again, really, and I don't have to tell you, you've experienced this as well as I have, drive is very hard to identify in an interview, especially when you don't have a pre-hire assessment, because the second point is that people are at their best from presenting themselves. What you don't really see is really what is behind, kind of like the Wizard of Oz component. What really is driving them, and really what are they about as an individual? So in a lot of ways, if you're just making a judgment on how the person has presented themselves, you can fall in the trap where people that are good, really good actors, and you can mistake that for being good originators. So again, the interview, if that is all that you're making a decision on, then it can be really misleading, which is obviously what happens for many hiring managers. And I think finally, what we try to do in making the interview more objective, the industry, and again, I don't have to tell you, the industry is really very focused on, well, show me your W-2. Well, the W-2 strategy is really defective, especially when you're looking at a W-2 that is composed of a HARP loans or composed of really what was a refi market. So our inability to really kind of focus on the drive issue in our candidates really does kind of circle back to, it's really difficult in the interview, if it's just the interview that you're making your decision on, is to make the determination, does that person have energy, are they optimistic, are they resilient, and so forth, characteristics that really can be identified more easily through the pre-hire assessment. When you look at, and again, when we work with mortgage companies, there are really 3 steps for a structured hiring process. Obviously, the first step is really the objective component. Do they have the talent? And so typically what that is looking like, that's where you fit in the role of a pre-hire assessment, that you have have found the individual that you're interested in basically recruiting. The person has submitted their resume. You might have had an initial phone call, but in other words, you need to develop really early on, does this person have sales talent, which is this whole drive component, in addition to the relationship skills? Do they have the right combination of those 9 personality traits? Well, you want to determine that early on, so you're not really wasting your time with people that basically do not have. And then obviously the second phase with an effective structured hiring process is to really have an interview that is delving into, does that individual match to our culture, and does that individual match to our sales approach? In mortgage banking, a lot of times, I think lenders really lessen the value of what they think the cultural match and the sales process match should be about. We often have a technique of really just kind of hiring originators from lots of different companies and hoping that they match to our company. Well, of course, really what the interview should be when you're moving into the face-to-face component of it, once you've determined that they've had the talent, the next part of it should be, do they fit our culture? And I certainly can tell you from a consulting standpoint, everybody has a much different culture versus other companies. That's really what makes you unique. And do they match to your sales process? Again, I think companies don't really spend enough time in the interview process where the person's done X volume, and then we really later find out that they're really good on jumbo loans, and you really don't do jumbo loans. So that's where the face-to-face interview really needs to be about. The sales talent's already been determined, and then obviously the next part of it, do they match your culture, and do they match to your sales process? And part of that should be also including a sales presentation. We don't do that often in mortgage banking, and it really is certainly not a good idea not to do that, because we make the assumption that just because they've been in the business 20 years or so, or whatever it is, that we assume that they can make presentation. Trust me, from a consulting standpoint and also from a training perspective, I see every day where originators really can't make a very effective sales presentation. That's why during the interview process, there should be things that you should be focusing on. And finally, the last part of an effective hiring process is really your reference check and your background checks. Pretty much most companies do very well with those. Really where things start to fall down is in the first part and the second part where we haven't identified if they have the talent, and the second part is that we haven't really matched them to our culture or to our sales process. So when you look at, and let's talk a little bit more about basically where do they have the talent, has that been identified? Again, that's where pre-hires come in and help you with that. In our particular pre-hire, we are actually measuring their relationship skills and the drive component of it. So that's what is the sum total of these 9 personality traits that I'm mentioning today. We're going to look at what those traits are a little bit more in depth, and we're going to do basically just a little analysis of 2 different candidates, one that is weak and one that is strong. Let's look at the weak candidate. Is someone, and this is an example that we use often when we're presenting to companies ourselves, is that the weak candidate is someone, if you look at the 9 traits that have a line that represents the norm for the group, the traits move from the energetic all the way down to positive about people, and the lines certainly have different lengths based upon what we see as the norm for that particular trait. But typically, what you're looking at is that in this case, where the box represents the individual candidate and where they fell versus what is the norm in the group, as you can see in this example, the individual has low energy. Again, it's not saying that they don't have any energy. We're saying that they don't have the amount of energy that high performers basically have. So from that viewpoint, the individual does not have that particular trait that's one part of the drive competency that you're looking for. When you look at follow-through, which is the focus component of drive, that individual, again, we're not saying they don't have any follow-through or focus, but we're saying that this person doesn't have enough to fit within what is the norm for a group. On the optimism side of it, as you can see where the box falls, that individual is an optimistic person. Likewise, when you look at where they fall on a resilience standpoint, they're going to basically, essentially be someone that does seem to be very optimistic and obviously resilient. When you look at the assertiveness, this is going to be somebody who has a need to persuade. That's an individual that, again, what we're really kind of painting, that this is going to be a person that it's going to be actually fun to interview. When you look at the social scale, the person is highly social, which is actually this issue of having the personality trait of liking to help people. So again, optimistic, they're resilient, they're assertive, and they are basically, essentially a fun person to talk to. The problem is that when you move into the other traits that are very important in mortgage banking, these are traits where, again, they don't have the drive side of it, which is really the crucial, critical part. And those are critical parts are really reflected by when you look at where does the candidate fall on the norm for the self-reliance trait. Well, in this case, the person basically, again, fun to interview, but really when it comes down to it, not a very self-reliant person, or someone that you would call a self-starter, somebody that's self-sufficient. Again, the kind of the layman terms for what self-reliance is all about. And finally, the positive about people, again, this person is positive about people, that all of the traits that are the traits on the drive side of it really are things that the particular candidate did not do well. So again, when you look at it in the big picture, this would be some person that, again, fun to talk to, is going to be looking like a really nice person, is going to be somebody who definitely likes to talk, but the reality of it is that they are missing parts of it that are really critical, and when you get them out into the field, these are going to be the same people that have slow ramp up, can't produce the numbers or inconsistent results. And so finally, the last part of the traits that are important that I haven't mentioned so far is the trait about expressiveness. Kind of interesting about mortgage banking, we always think that the originator has to be someone that has a gift of gab and loves to talk. Well, what we really find is that's not the case, and that's why the norm that's represented by that particular trait is expressiveness. And so as you see, it's on the left-hand side, which tells you that what actually is the predictive component of it is that an individual that has low expressiveness is actually somebody that's a listener, is more reserved, and basically wants to hear what the customer has to say before they start speaking. In this particular candidate's case, that individual did have low expressiveness, was actually a good component of it. So when you take the total of the 9 traits, very similar to FICO scoring is what's going on in the model component of it, the person doesn't have the right combination of traits in the right area that they need to have, and as a result, this weak candidate would be somebody that we would say would essentially kind of fail the assessment because they are, in essence, from a calculation standpoint, not having enough of the traits to actually generate someone that would be having a greater than 50% chance to be successful. Assessment testing is a modeling that's very similar to FICO score modeling, and what is actually occurring in our assessment is that we're looking at individuals that have less than a 50% chance to be successful, and those are people that we would tell you that you should not pursue from an interview standpoint, and in other words, look for another candidate, versus people that have a greater than a 50% chance, which would be individuals that we would recommend that would move further into your interview process. We also look at and analyze 2 other things, especially for companies that are looking at rookies or new people to the industry, which is certainly some of the strategies that many companies are looking at today. When you're looking at the 2 of being serious-minded, it really tells you something about the individual and how serious they are about the position. And likewise, accommodating is put in there as a trait because accommodating is really the issue of, is that person a win-win type of person, or is that an individual that basically has everything on their side? So again, when you look at this particular candidate and then you look at the person that was on the strong candidate side, you will see that, again, the candidate has some good things about them, but not what the strong candidate has. The strong candidate is an individual that has the right energy profile, is focused, is an optimistic person, highly resilient, the assertive side, and the social side is there. When it comes to the important mortgage banking traits of low expressiveness and a high self-reliance and positive about people, this candidate actually is an actual candidate. Basically what we are saying is that this is a candidate that has a greater than 50% chance to be successful, and therefore somebody that you would want to continue the interview process. And the next step of the interview round should be this face-to-face meeting that is a cultural match meeting and also a sales process meeting, because we've now identified for you, do they have the talent? Obviously, if they have the talent and then they're a cultural match and a sales process match, then you can go more in depth with basically your interview process with that person. So why don't we have a few seconds to answer any questions about some of the traits that I've already talked about, and answer any questions that you might have. So if you could take the chat feature and certainly write any questions that you would have, I'd be glad to answer them.
Yes, got a quick question.
Yes?
What's the significance of the bars to the left and the right of the square?
The bars represent the norm in the group. Okay, so every trait has a certain value to it, and the trait value is basically what is the model. And so when they're onto the right-hand side, as you see, 8 of them are on the right-hand side. That's reflecting the more that you have of that particular trait, basically the better you are. The one that's on the left-hand side is just graphically representing that the trait of expressiveness, what is important is not more expressiveness, but less expressiveness. And so, again, the lines just represent the norm for that particular trait. We have some other questions that I would like to answer. Yeah, another question is about expressiveness. Really what makes mortgage banking origination different than other selling consultative positions is that is this trait of expressiveness. As I've already mentioned, expressiveness typically in sales and professional selling, the more like a pharmaceutical salesperson or someone like that, expressiveness would be reflective of somebody that you would call somewhat of a talker. What we see with mortgage origination, and I think it really does center with the issue of you are dealing with a consumer's, personal investment situation, and what we see is that the top achievers have low expressiveness, and what that means is they're more apt to listen, they're more apt to be reserved, so they can give the customer a time to basically kind of present what is going on in their life. So your top originators definitely fall into the track of being people that are more of a listener than a talker. Because if you're always trying to out-talk them, that doesn't really work with mortgage origination. Hopefully that answers your question. Any other questions that I can answer? Great. Let's talk a little bit about what is the next part of the assessment component. So there's the first part of it is the predictive part of it. What you're seeing is essentially an analysis of the particular personality traits, and then we're doing a weighting component of it, and then we're making a prediction on whether the person falls below 50% or falls above 50%. So once that's occurred, obviously candidates will have a mix of traits. The trick is do they have enough of the good traits to be essentially above 50%. Even when they are above 50%, what occurs is every person has weaknesses and issues that should be discussed during the interview process, again, this face-to-face meeting. And that's the part where the second part of the assessment is the customized behavioral questions. All of you, I'm sure, have heard about behavioral interviewing. We have a tendency in mortgage banking, especially to, start talking about interest rates. We start talking about who we know. We start selling the company way too early in the interview process. What we need to do is, in essence, is hone in before we hire the candidate, really what are the strengths and weaknesses of the person. So what is reflective in this slide is that in our pre-hire assessment, we're actually analyzing and providing you, for the interviewing standpoint, questions that are tied together wherever the person fell into what we would consider like weakness within the norm group. So wherever there's a weakness, we would generate a behavioral-based question for that person. Companies love this, obviously, and hiring managers love this because it takes away this issue. If you're always talking about rates, you're always talking about your book of business, you really aren't getting that insight during the interview process on whether the actual person, how good a salesman are they. To judge it off a W-2, again, doesn't give you a really clear picture, especially when we've had so much HARP and we've had so much refining in the last, really for a long time. So again, honing in on what makes that person tick is really the purpose of the behavioral-based questions. And then the third part of this report is a report where we've kind of summarized, person's good and bad, and then we've told the manager, the hiring manager, what it's going to be like to actually manage the person. And that's an important component to really kind of understand. So when you're looking at low energy, you'd say, well, that's not that bad if the person has low energy. But in reality, what it means for you as a manager is that you are going to this person has a hard time with a demanding work pace. Well, as we all know, mortgage banking requires a demanding work pace. So again, we're kind of summarizing for you this whole issue of, what basically is behind what they're presenting to you in their acting mode about why you should hire them versus the issue of what really are they about. And so from a bottom line standpoint, drive for sure is critical to origination, not just today, but really going in the next, foreseeable future. This whole issue of retail loan officers, and obviously on the account executive component, the business isn't coming to you. The business is where you have to go get it. And the reality of it is that no training is really going to instill drive. So it's our jobs as hiring managers to look at individuals from the standpoint of what is their talent base that they're bringing to the plate. Obviously, this is pretty similar to an analysis that you would be doing if you were looking at a sports team, whether it's basketball or football or golf or whatever. One of those traits that that person brings to the plate, they really are early on formed traits, and so it's our job as managers to recognize who has them. I do think part of what we are saying also today, because these traits are linked with what it takes to be successful in mortgage origination, it does reconfirm this issue that we could, as an industry, really look at people outside the industry if they have the traits and then teach them the business. Too often what you see with companies is that they think that the business can't be taught, but what you can teach is the drive part. You can teach the product part and certainly the information, the sales process side that you know from your experience that would make that individual successful. So in the big picture, the structured interview process, what we're saying is it's a component of 3 parts, and those parts start with, obviously, an evaluation of talent. That's where the pre-hire assessment comes in, where you're doing that, where the candidate themselves are really completing what is a questionnaire before really you start investing time and money on whether the person can sell. That part really gets identified and really is objectively analyzed. So what you have to do when you actually are completing the face-to-face meeting side of it is that you are doing it to see, is there a culture match? And a culture is really being defined as how you do business, and does that person match with how you do business? And then also the sales process component of it. If your sweet spot is the issue of you only do FHA, and those people are doing conventional, or likewise if there's a product mix that doesn't really match, or how you handle from a processor standpoint, that becomes where you were focusing on basically in the analysis of whether that person, assuming they have the talent, does that person match to your company? And then the final part of it is obviously requiring them to do a sales presentation. That should be really always part of your structured interview process, including the issue of having the candidate give you a one-page marketing plan. Certainly all of our clients are really taught how to do that, but you really need to get this information beforehand before you hire them. For those that will say, well, gee, I only look for top producers, and I really am concerned about having to ask them to pass so many hurdles. I have to tell you that a couple things, certainly in the big picture side of it, top producers, when you are getting, let's say, people that are between 8 and 12 million, which is fairly typical with what most companies are recruiting today, you are not getting an 8 to 10 million or $12 million originator. You are really getting somebody that's going to lose half their pipeline because their referral sources won't come with them when they move to another company. And so what that means is that you are basically making a determination on a much less effective originator. So does that person have that ability or the drive to really rebuild their business? And that's why it's pretty serious when you are recruiting from experienced originators to really address this issue of having the hurdles in place to really determine are they going to rebuild their pipeline, because obviously that's what you're looking for in your recruiting side of it.